Past several years, we've been here at the Catholic Theological Union here in Chicago, sponsoring this talk, the Paul Wattson Lecture. Paul Wattson was the co-founder of the Society of the Atonement with Mother Lorena White. Our community was founded in 1898 in the Hudson Valley as an Episcopalian order. So Father Paul was born in a time, unfortunately, like the times of today, where there were so many wars that were going on. In fact, on the day that he was born, the front page of the New York Times listed all the people that had died during the Civil War. Then after that, the Spanish-American War, all these Indian-American wars, French-American wars, all these wars were happening in the 1800s. It was a terrible time of war. He used to say there isn't a mantelpiece in a house that doesn't have a memorabilia for someone who's passed away. So many people have been touched by the loss of life during that time. So he was called to find something that would be about unity. He opened up the scriptures 3 times. One of the scripture passages that jumped off the page to him was Romans 5:11 from the King James Version. We joy in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received the atonement, the at-one-ment. All things are brought into one through the gift, the incarnation of Jesus Christ. So he and Mother Lorena founded that order. For 11 years, they were an Episcopalian order. In 1908, Father Paul started the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity that we still celebrate now every January. And the year later, the Friars and Sisters of the Atonement came into full communion with the Catholic Church. When we were Episcopalian, the Society of the Atonement worked. When we came into full communion, we were split into a men's community and a women's community. It is now our pleasure to say that we're celebrating 125 years this year of our community. So this is a special talk, a special time for us. Our foundation day is December 15th. That's when we'll have the initial celebration, but we have these events leading up to this. Several weeks ago, the Archbishop of Canterbury came and visited us at Greymoor to celebrate the 50 years anniversary of the first Archbishop of Canterbury coming to visit Greymoor. And now we have this excellent talk we're going to hear this evening by Angelique. We're very, very pleased to have the opportunity for her to speak with us. We found out as we keep talking, we're family. We find about so many different ways that she has touched with the Friars and the Sisters of the Atonement over history. So we're very happy to celebrate that. We believe we're called today to promote hope, healing, and harmony. We work in pastoral settings. We work in alcohol and drug rehabilitation in the New York area at St. Christopher's Inn. It's a 160-bed facility for men suffering from substance abuse, and we work in ecumenical and interreligious dialogue. We have the Greymoor and Ecumenical and Interreligious Institute, which helps sponsor this talk this evening. We have the Centro Peronioni in Rome, and many friars have worked as ecumenical directors for dioceses all across the world. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce to you the Vicar General of the Friars of the Atonement, Father James Loughran, who will now introduce our speaker tonight. He is the director of the Ecumenical and Interreligious Institute that is in New York City. So, Father Jim.
Thank you, Father Brian, and thank you everyone for being here tonight, and for those of you who are viewing online. It's my pleasure, it's not just a pleasure, it's a real honor to invite Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith, Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith, to give us this Paul Wattson lecture tonight. She is, right now, she wears so many hats. It's amazing how dynamic and illustrious a servant of God she is, and in so many ways. So she works primarily, though, for Bread for the World as their strategist for Pan-African Orthodox and ecumenical faith engagement. And that says a lot itself about the ecumenical movement, because of the whole idea about the Pan-African commitment of so many Christians in that continent and in the diaspora. It also talks a lot about the fact that the Orthodox and the entire ecumenical outreach of Bread for the World, which is such an important organization. For over 50 years, they've been advocating for the feeding of the world. The world's hungry, especially in places where there is disproportionate hunger right now. particularly in places throughout the African subcontinent and even right these days in Ukraine and other places. And so the Bread for the World is a marvelous organization. And so Dr. Walker Smith does that kind of work for them. Recently, though, she was elected to be one of the 8 presidents of the World Council of Churches, representing the presidency for North America. And so we're very happy for her and happy for the World Council that she's part of that group of 8 presidents. She was speaking earlier tonight about being the voices of wisdom to the council, and that's for sure. That's for sure. She got her doctorate at Princeton University, and the subject matter was connected to a theme that has been running all throughout her life about hospitality. In this case, it was the whole notion of being able to welcome back, lovingly welcome back, incarcerated African-American women, and the real obligation we all have to all the former incarcerated, but particularly to those who are overly incarcerated, you might say, like African-American women. And so she did that.
And the tribe.
Yes. And so it really is great to have you, not just because of the background you have educationally, the books that you've written, and the commitment that you obviously have to ecumenical dialogue, but because of the friendship that you've maintained with so many organizations, so many peoples, the hospitality that you've shown theologically to so many different kinds of people. And so with that, I welcome the Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker Smith to give us the Paul Wattson lecture.
Good evening.
All right.
It's been a pleasant evening so far. I want to thank this wonderful school and all the schools that have welcomed me for this opportunity to share with you. It's been I've been a real recipient of hospitality on these past hours, and I am very grateful that you have thought enough of me to invite me to experience it on this evening. It is my joy to begin my time by providing greetings to you from Bread for the World in Washington, D.C. And happily, Father Jim already told you all about it, so I don't have to go too much further with what Bread does. We are approaching our 50th anniversary within the next couple of years, so you can imagine things are quite strenuous with the labors and the work, and especially with the conflicts that are going on. There's just a lot that has brought us to this moment of having to increase our voice, to increase our hearts relative to those affected by hunger and poverty and the root causes of why that exists. It is truly a challenge, but we believe God is with us in the great work. It is also my joy to bring greetings to you from the World Council of Churches. We are celebrating 75 years this year. And I'm very honored to tell you that in June of this year, we had grand celebrations at our Central Committee meeting where we did just that. And I was honored to be one of the speakers talking in some similar ways to what I'm talking about today for that great celebration. We will be celebrating the 75th again within the next few weeks. I'm on my way to a place called Abuja, Nigeria. I was speaking with the president, the vice chancellor, I think it is, here at the school, the dean, and he was saying, I'm from Nigeria. So I've been learning more about the great country we're on the way to, and they are celebrating there in the All Africa Conference of Churches 60 years. This is a big year in the Pan-African space for the number 60. The March on Washington, 60 years. And I was honored to speak there in August for the March on Washington for the World Council, and then the All Africa Conference of Churches, and yes, the founding of the African Union, of course, whose predecessor is the Organization of African Unity. So 60 is a big deal this year as well. And then finally, I'd like to give greetings on behalf of my president, the Reverend Dr. Jerry Young, who is the president of the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated. It is my joy to work with him and the rest of the fellowship. I'm a daughter of the National Baptist Convention. My father was a pastor in that convention, and so I am a PK, if you will. And so I bring you those greetings. My dear brothers and sisters, we are on the eve of a great moment in the ecumenical life from the ancient days. And I know many of you already know that, but I want to mention it again here. I'm going to I'm going to try to work with this technology here. Let's see here. What did I do wrong?
Nothing yet.
There we are. There we are. We are on the eve in 2025 of the great commemoration of the Ecumenical Council of 325. And we are approaching that moment with great vigor with the World Council of Churches. And I think in this moment, we need to say that this is 2023. So 2 years from now, that council will have its moment. And if all things work together, many of us will be there together to remember the ancient moment of the ecumenical councils. Of course, there were 7, but this is the first one. And it's quite important as we think about the legacy that we're going to be engaging around women of African descent. This 325 was a major moment for all of the faithful at that time. And so as we come together in this moment of global Christianity, we know that 2025 will be a very important year as well. I was having conversation with some of the leadership over the dinner. We were talking about these changing landscape that is happening. Similarly, that was the case in 325. So this is a very old conversation that we are having. And as I was having that conversation with the leadership, I was saying that in many respects, many of the dynamics are still the same. The more things change, sometimes the more things stay the same. And I think 2025 is going to be that very important moment of reflection of what that looks like when we think beyond 2025. In this moment, in particular, we see the growth of Christianity, particularly in the global South. Not only in places like Africa, but throughout the Americas. Sometimes I think we think over there somewhere, oh yes, that's happening over in Africa, or that's happening just in Latin America. The truth is that we have missions coming to the United States, coming to Canada from, quote unquote, the global South. Our mission field, our Christianity, the whole presence of Christianity is quite globalized wherever we are. And although we know that the figures, as we think about things geographically, are concentrated in certain areas, the truth is that this global reality within technology is really showing that we're very akin to it right up the street here in Chicago, just as we are if we go to other places outside of this context. But unfortunately, as I've just said, relative to Bread for the World, this is also an intensified moment of conflict, of war, and still hope and faithfulness of the churches. That's also important to say whenever we speak of the dire circumstances, that the churches still give hope and faithfulness to the occasions of these challenges. Yes, our hearts do break as we see what is happening in Israel, Palestine, and the entire region where Jesus walked and where he chose his disciples and called us to be one. All of that is happening where Jesus walked. But still, we are called to this ministry of visible unity, not just unity that has been gifted to us, but the visible unity that we are called to in any moment in time. And then also the calls of mission and justice, and yes, evangelism. Yes, our hearts break not only there, but for Ukraine, Russia, the Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, a war that's been going on for many years that doesn't get the attention that it rightfully deserves. Or we think about what happened in Maui with the fires and climate that is happening in this moment. Mass incarceration, the streets in the United States, these are all places of conflict and also different degrees that have actually eventuated into war, where violence is seen as the answer, as opposed to settling our different differences and our divergences. Yes, this is a moment of what I would call Sankofa. It is a moment of Sankofa where we must understand more about our past in order to understand our present and the future. Sankofa, living in the kairos of the past, present, and future. It is in light of this context that we are in now. And this reflection, even since 325, again, as I mentioned, as a major moment in the ecumenical movement, that we probe this conversation of our ecumenical journey with Pan-African women of faith and a multi-generational lens to understand it. I brought this slide here to begin that particular turn in the lecture for this evening. This is, I like this. I love icons. Let me just say, you're seeing another side of me now. I love iconography and the imagery that it brings to describing the embodiment of the faithful, It's another reason why I enjoy my portfolio, not only in the Pan-African space, but also the Orthodox space. Because as you know, in the Orthodox community, iconography is a key into the spirituality of the people. But this is a depiction of 325, showing the diversities of peoples at that time that were at that table. I thought you might appreciate that more ancient depiction of 325. But this lecture also is not only to probe since that time, but even earlier to the biblical times when it comes to the matter of Pan-African women of faith. And it is in that regard, I want to lift up one who's in my company, who joins me as I take this turn in my lecture. I am delighted to have one of my sisters who's here, who works with me in this work, Dr. Kimberly Lymore. She is one of our leaders in that movement to help us rewrite a narrative relative to Pan-African women's perspective of having been there since the very beginning. Since the very beginning. There is a book that is coming out that is related to this movement that does just that. Now, the book will primarily focus on Pan-African women, primarily from 1900s, 1939 up to 1983. But because of your invitation, I want to probe before that period. So in a way, today is more part one to get to part two, which, by the way, is next Wednesday on All Saints Day, when that book will launch. So thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit more about part one. And that is really looking back to the more ancient and biblical days, where Pan-African women, women of Africa, were particularly at the beginning of Scripture and at the beginning of the ancient church through the apostolic age, through the medieval age, and all the different ages. Oftentimes, that particular lineage is not identified in some of the more conventional teachings. And we seek to say there's something more to say about that. My former moderator, and if you're part of World Council, your former moderator, Dr. Canon Agnes Aboam from Kenya, was the first lay woman to be the moderator of the World Council of Churches. One of the honors that I had in 2013 was to be one of the persons when elected to the Central Committee in Busan, South Korea, to help elect her to be our moderator. I am very pleased to say that she and I had been friends. She passed away, unfortunately, May 31st of this year, a sister beloved, but we had known each other since the early 90s. So I have traveled a long time with Dr. Agnes, and she is the writer of the foreword of the book that is coming out. We consulted together our journeys and reflected critically on what needed to be said in the book that is forthcoming. But in the opening foreword, I'm going to quote a bit from the opening foreword because it sets the tone not only for the book that is coming, but also for this ancient period we're going to reflect on a little bit more in this moment as we prepare for next Wednesday on All Saints' Day. But she says this in her foreword, and I just think she said it so wonderfully. Her whole foreword, in fact, she could have just wrote a paper on just the foreword because it's so well written. PhD from, I think it was in Sweden that she received her PhD, but just extremely capable and led the World Council through COVID, through many conflicts and challenges. It was really difficult for the WCC, as for all of us during that period of time, but she led with a great spirit as a Pan-African woman, and Dr. Lymore joins me today as part of that fellowship. But she pins these words in the foreword. She says, "It is important to understand that the contributions of Pan-African women of faith are a part not only of the modern ecumenical movement, but of the ancient and historical narratives of churches as well." Then from our website, she quotes on, "Since the earliest accounts in Genesis, women of African descent and of Africa have played a critical role in shaping the Christian faith. Now is the time to have a deeper understanding of Pan-African women's leadership from women like Hagar and Zipporah in the Bible to the modern ecumenical movement." Therefore, hearing her words, as you already probably know, and I'm going to see if I can advance this before I get to these questions. I'm going to go to this overview here. The overview is then that this lecture seeks to both honor and probe the ancient and modern leadership of Pan-African women of faith in the Christian movement of unity, justice, and mission. The lecture is going to continually follow with a multi-generational framework that rewrites an ecumenical narrative with the contributions of these hidden sheroes of the Christian faith from a Pan-African lens. This presentation and discussion is timely. And why is it timely? Not only for the reasons I've stated, but also because of the increasing, not just the changing, but the increasing changing landscape of Christianity's rise in Africa, in the Caribbean, Latin America, and diaspora communities. As we think about this overview, we also want to think about what has been the history since 325 and even before. I am smart enough to know not to claim to be a historian. I am not. However, I was taught a little bit. And what I've done is try to just provide a summary of the journey that all of us have been on relative to conventional approaches to church history, right? So we kind of start with that biblical period, We get into the Apostolic Age, the Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, the Ecumenical Councils, of which there are 7. And then we get more so into the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, 1300 to 1564. And here also the eve of colonization. And when you talk about Pan-African women, that's really important to name when we talk about church history, because there, and I'll show a map here shortly, you'll see where they're starting the movements of pushing people from Africa into other parts of the world, often not by choice, but by force.
Right.
And then we come to the early modern period thereabouts. And then here we see the intensification of colonization and also, quote, Christianization of the, quote, Americas, right? Knowing and naming that indigenous persons were already here before that took place. And then we come to the late kind of modern period here. And here I've included not only the intensification of colonization and racism and gender, but also you're getting closer now through the missionary movement. You're getting to that place whereby you're starting to see the eve of what will become the modern ecumenical movement, right? And then we come here to, sorry. Go back. The very sensitive gadget that I have here.
Yep.
And then we come to the emergence, we come through the ecumenical century. A lot of people have written a lot of scholarship about the ecumenical century through the 1900s. And then we come to all the way through to the early 2000s. Still, I would say you're seeing some vestiges of what was called the ecumenical century into the period of the expansion of what is being referred to as global Christianity. Now, I just want to lay that out because I think that's not all the different terms that different historians use, but it kind of gives you an overview. And just to refresh your mind as you're thinking about this legacy of Pan-African women. But there's another timeline. There are parallel timelines, yes? So we have the more conventional one, but I would argue there's also a Pan-African timeline as well. Now, unfortunately, I was not able to have all of it here. I'm just going to summarize it here very quickly. But in a Pan-African viewpoint, things begin and end on the continent of Africa. Of course, Africa did not look like this in the earliest days, but I put it up there as at least a symbol of, if you will, that originating place, if you will, of Africa, yeah? This is a bit what Africa looks like, but it really isn't. Africa is always changing. It's always fluid, right? You have names that keep changing because people are identifying a post-colonial way to understand their present moment. You have fluidity of peoples. You have people of African descent living on the continent again and claiming their roots. But Africa is very fluid. And also, we remember when we speak about this, that before 1884 in particular, we need to remember that in 1884 and 1885 was what was called the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference, whereby Europeans and those in the West from North America in particular as well, were present at a table and decided in an imperialistic way how they would divide up the continent of Africa. And so this in part is how you get this map right here. It's from the Berlin Conference. But before the Berlin Conference, you have to my right the timeline relative to the export of people of Africa throughout the world. And here this map is seeking to try to show you just at even a visual, even if you can't see it, just all the diverse places that people of Africa were sent throughout the world to provide labor in most cases, the white settlers who were going abroad as well, including the Americas. But I think this is a very important image because this is how we come to this term of Pan-African. Pan-African says this timeline, this narrative is appropriate for all people of Africa, African peoples. And so this terminology, Pan-African, is trying to give us an understanding that there is a common narrative that belongs to people of African descent. In the book, An Unbroken Circle, there is an argument that the ancient apostolic Orthodox Christianity that was born even before this period, all the way back to the early hundreds, right, with Jesus. I mean, we're talking about the Ethiopian eunuch, all of that goes into even prior to this period. That's very important because although this is happening, we know that Christianity from Africa was always there, particularly in the Horn of Africa. So if you look there to the Horn there in Egypt, and you look in Ethiopia, you will find these places. So there is this sense that there is this history that goes before the colonial period and during the colonial period and the post-colonial period. In so doing, Pan-African women have been a part of all of that. Both these timelines, both of these histories directly impact how it is women in those contexts come to be leaders, despite what may appear to be the challenges of that time. I want to go to the next slide here. No, not the next one. Hold on a second. So as far back as the Old Testament, not even just Christianity in the New Testament, we do have the stories of Hagar. On Sunday, I had the opportunity to preach a text that I don't often hear preached as well from Exodus, the 2nd chapter, 1 to 10, where the daughter of Pharaoh, as well as the Jochebed, who is the mother, the biological mother of Moses, are together. And Hagar, the daughter of Pharaoh, they're all women of Africa. And there are books that have come out now within the last 5 years, and I want to cite some of them here because I'm just not going to have the time, but I want to invite you to take a look at them. This book that is recently out, just in 2019, revealing, quote, Black women in the Bible 2019, where she identifies 32 women featured in this book, talking about their not only stories finally being told, but each is a display of beautiful, colorful photos, etc., talking about the life of Pan-African women in the Old Testament and the New Testament era. There's just a lot of new scholarship that has been coming out within the last, back up here, within the last few years that talk about these issues. This is another one, African Women in the Hebrew Bible, a social, economic, and African hermeneutical reading. Also talking about this same point. I really want to encourage you because it's been within the last 5 to 10 years where we're getting more of this kind of more Pan-African lens of how it is Pan-African women were always doing unity, mission, and justice. I'm not trying to preach today, but I do want to say one thing. When we think about someone like Hagar, for example, we have to think about particularly the issues of justice. You remember her story. She was enslaved by the Israelite enslavers of Sarah and Abraham. And you remember, because she was the handmaiden to them, that she was She was enslaved at the time. But Hagar does something very different. And this is where I really want to encourage you as you think about preaching, you think about teaching, how you look at these lenses. There's material out there to help you do this. But Hagar does not remain in her enslavement. You remember, she leaves. She makes a different choice. She knows that she's being treated unjustly. And she seeks a case outside of her enslaved situation. She chooses the wilderness. And what happens there? In the wilderness, who does she encounter? She encounters the holy. And she comes to this realization that there is still another way. Yes, she ends up going back. She makes a decision to go back, but the fact that she turned away from the unjust treatment to see if there was another way for her says something about how women of Africa and African descent have engaged their freedom. Harriet Tubman may come to your mind in this later age as we think about Pan-African women. And in the book, we talk about how, like Hagar, women of Africa and African descent have always been seen by God. And so it doesn't matter which generation that you're looking at. This particular principle of knowing that you are seen by God is a multi-generational principle. And it goes all the way back to the story of Hagar. It's Dolores Williams who really talks about that in her book about the wilderness. She's passed on now, but her wonderful work about this kind of lays a wonderful foundation of this principle when it comes to Pan-African women and a kind of multi-generational theological lens around justice. But I would offer to you, as we go further, and again, these are texts you can look at, that you also have this very important period relative to this lineage of sainthood, right? There's a whole body of literature, particularly in the Orthodox traditions and also in the Catholic traditions, around sainthood and who's the saint. And in this wonderful icon, again, you're seeing another side of me, you have about 5 women who are mentioned here of the saints of Africa that come out of the Orthodox family. And it talks about, there are about 5 women that are in there who are basically, when you look at their stories, and I do mention a few of them in the book that I have coming out, where they have traversed the wilderness as well. They live in the desert, or they do mission work, or they see signs of the holy when others don't see it. They're both their bodies and their mind and their spirit is given unto God, and they're finding new ways for the poor to come to the table by virtue of their witness. Yes, we're talking about during the ancient days of the church and in the desert. And this particular icon from the saints of Africa that are offered to us talks about that. That's an important period too. So you go from the biblical times, I just gave you a couple illustrations, but you come into this early period of the churches, and the Coptic church and the Ethiopian Orthodox church. They have these lineages of the saints and the mothers who have traversed in the desert, and also some who have been martyred, as well as other saints that we know of that period. One of the persons I wanted to lift up was Saint Josephine Bakita, and I know some of you know that name here in this family here. But this is an example that I would like to offer up, even in the Catholic Church, of one of the women of that same period of time that we want to remember. And these are women, again, of mission, who knew justice. And they sought unity, and the lineage shows, when you look at their stories, it's a lineage not only of unity for unity's sake, but it's a unity that's trying to transcend some of the evils and the hardships that we know about Africa and African peoples when we look at the longer term narrative. Harriet Tubman, if we bounce back up to the 1800s, we will see also had visions and was actually struck down at times when she was taking people to freedom. But these are themes that you will see around Pan-African women even before you get to the modern period. I do want to mention, because I'm in Catholic space, these 6 Black Catholics who are on the road to sainthood. I think it's important to mention them here since I'm being hosted in such a way that I am. And we want to lift them up because they are examples that not only are of the prior periods, but also of the more modern periods as well. So I want to lift them up and to say, okay, I'm Baptist, but I'm with you in the advocacy of these saints that include Pan-African women. This is, I understand, I'm told I had somebody doing time for me that I'm getting close to the end of my time. But I do want to encourage you to probe these pieces more deeply, to probe these periods, these ancient periods, the apostolic period, the biblical periods, those periods in terms of the legacy of women of Africa and of African descent. Unfortunately, we have been marginalized at best, and so often have been made to be invisible. But in this moment, we want to all help rewrite that narrative. And we also want to help promote that in theological education. And it doesn't matter which discipline you're dealing with, whether it's church history, whether it's ethics, whether it's Bible, whether it's practical theology, the invitation is for you to make more visible the lineage and the contributions of Pan-African women, because together God sees us as well. And part of our charge in the Christian faith is for all to feel invited to the table. So I encourage you to do so. I hope this has been helpful. I can't believe my time is almost, it's over basically, but I would love to have some conversation with you if you would like. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Walker Smith. We have time to take some questions, and those online, you can type your question in the chat box and we will do our best to read those questions out. And I want to start with those in the room. And we have some microphone. Do we have some microphone, Letitia? Thank you. Thank you. So if you question from that speaker.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Anthony. Just in thinking about, we have been talking about and doing the work of rewriting the narrative. How can just ordinary people get involved with doing that? We do it in our groupings and in academia sometimes, or in different organizations, but just the people, I noticed, like I say, our people in the ground, in the pews, how do they get involved with rewriting the narrative?
Well, thank you so much. When I was meeting with some of the leadership earlier, I was talking about something similar in the classroom, but I would say the world is our classroom. And I would say that at the congregational level, that's kind of what I'm hearing at the congregational level, is having done ecumenical work at the local levels especially, I really think it's a matter of, again, inviting those who are not like you. How can we encourage congregational leaders to be comfortable being uncomfortable?
Yeah.
I just think that's what the gospel message is about. Jesus just made people uncomfortable. he's going around talking to women and children and lepers and I mean, all the rest. And it seems to me that's a basic principle of the faith. So if congregational leaders could just, and, you know, I know there are a number of cohorts like the Lillian Dam and all these different places. I mean, if there could be just a principle, a basic principle to say, in whatever we're doing, we're choosing to be uncomfortable. We're making a choice. We understand that. We understand that the person from Syria down the street is not like the experience I've had here. In Chicago, as I've been here just for the last couple of days and was at one of our churches on Sunday for worship, everyone has been talking about the numbers of migrants that have been coming here from Venezuela, for example. And it, you know, it's really saying, wow, do I know Venezuela? Am I willing to be uncomfortable with that situation and say, I want that person or a person from that particular community to come and have coffee with me? It's not just about providing basics of clothes and shelter. Don't get me wrong, that's important. Keep doing that too. But it's also a matter of saying, can I invite you to have dinner with me? Can I invite you to pray with me? Can I come see your daughter who can't get in that school because she doesn't have a green card or whatever? So I think it just really starts at that level. It's with the Christian saying, I understand my faith is a faith that is uncomfortable. And to confess and to say, I'm used to being in places that are comfortable for me. Confess that. Just say it, acknowledge it in your prayer time and say, I want to do differently. So the Lord can work with your heart to prepare you to be in your discomfort. So I think it starts with that confession. The confession that I'm okay being uncomfortable. I don't know what that looks like. I'm really afraid. I'm probably not going to like this, but I understand that that's a principle of the faith. So I think it really starts with that confession and then saying, what does that look like for me? And then what is a leadership team of like only 2 or 3? You know, the Bible talks a lot about 2 or 3, where there's just 2 or 3 who are going to have that confession with me too. And figuring out then how can you mobilize a trend together with just a few that can maybe branch out, where it's wedded with prayer and it's wedded with an assessment where you do, I mean, sorry, we have bread, we do this a lot, you do the data, like who's in your community, right? That survey work, that who's in the area. So I do think though it begins with one's heart first. Because in the end, I don't think it's about just about Matthew 28. I mean, you know, clothing, feeding the neck and all that. I think it really is about hard work. And I think a lot of us really struggle at that level.
Combined.
Thank you for that question.
We have a question online. And the question is, a communal relationship between both gifts and challenges. What keeps you going when things get difficult in a communal setting?
You know, my tongue gets really sore. Because sometimes I just want to say, no, you didn't say that. Or that really hurt, or why did you do that? You know, so that's first thing. There might be a little physical pain because you're trying to be humble about it. But I would say that it's knowing, really, I mean, I think it's really a matter of saying that, first of all, you've already been praying about your confession, right? You already know when you go into a meeting, any basically World Council or church setting, you're going to be in a setting where there's someone at the table who arrived from some conflict situation. I mean, like war, who's going to be in the room with you, right? There was a meeting I was at just recently. There was a young woman in the meeting. I can't call her name because her safety would be in danger. But she came to the meeting and we were talking about taking a statement out on Myanmar. And we're all having our conversation. We want to stand with Myanmar. We want to do, we want to say just the right thing. It's horrible what's going on. I mean, just horrible. One of our delegates from Karjru last year, in fact, he sat next to me during my assembly meeting. He was right there with me. He's a pastor, wonderful Christian gentleman. But he's been taken hostage. Right now, he's still being held hostage over there in this moment. And we were trying to figure out how can we say just the right thing. And finally, she felt comfortable enough to say to us, I don't think I can get on the plane tomorrow. And a lot of us think about that too. We're like, oh no, that plane's not running on time, or I don't, it's all these kind of ordinary things, But she was sitting there at that moment actually saying to herself, I don't know if I can, because once I get off the plane, I may be arrested. Because I'm on the wrong side of the issue. And the pastor who's just been taken hostage is a friend. And she had already experienced the horror of having the police surrounding her home 1 month earlier. So I guess what I'm saying is what sustains me is that we had to stop and pray with her. We just had to do that. But the other thing we couldn't do is we couldn't make a public statement. We couldn't do it because she had to get on a plane tomorrow. And if the statement went out, they would know that she had something to do with it. So I think what sustains me is the humanity of the work. And the trying to create a tone of hospitality so that you are a part of a community that's doing the work, not just an intellectual doing the work or the research. Look, we got a great international affairs department. Peter is all that. But just this past June, just another example, we were disrupted by a young Haitian woman who said, get it done now. We're talking about postponing the statement because, you have to do all the homework, all the consultation with the member churches. We take that very seriously at Royal Council. And she stood up and said, we cannot wait. And we had to take 20 minutes out of the time together and work to hear what she had to say, that we had to do it now. Now, that was just the opposite response. But you go into those meetings and you realize we're really all in this together. And I think that's what helps to sustain me, is knowing that I'm willing, and not that I'm perfect, because sometimes I'm not willing, but I try to be willing to be disrupted. And know that when I go into any of those meetings, I just don't have the answers. We're finding them out together. So I think it's a gift of praying together, humility, and realizing that everything on the page lives. I think that's part of it.
Actually, we'll take one more.
Okay.
Thank you for your lecture and all that you've shared with us today. My question is, you opened up your talk tonight kind of describing the similarities between this current moment and the origins of the modern ecumenical movement, both times of war and conflict. And of course, that goes all through the history of Christianity into each of the ages that you've kind of put on your timeline. So my question is, in light of that, what do you think of as the primary purpose of the ecumenical movement? And have you seen progress in the ecumenical movement over the last decades?
Yeah. Your question is about progress, or what was the first one? Purpose. Yeah, so for me, I'm Baptist, like I really am. And for me, it's really quite biblical. It's the whole John passage, that they will be one as the Father is, with the Son. I just think we have a biblical mandate. And for me, that has authority, that has credibility. So for me, is trying to live out the prayer that Jesus prayed. That's where it comes down for me. Now, in terms of where we've seen the impact, or where the difference has been made in visible unity, which is what I hear in your question about progress. I think the ecumenical movement had everything to do with my being able to speak to you in this moment as a woman of African descent. I mean, what, 70 years ago? I probably wouldn't be here. You would have had someone else that looked like the majority that are in the room. You would have had me. I don't think. I could be wrong. I want to be wrong, but I don't think so. I think the ecumenical movement was present with people like Dr. Martin Luther King. The program to combat racism. The integrated patterns that have come over the last few decades. The African diaspora moving from the South in the Great Migration to the North, and had the courage to say, we will not be terrorized the way we've been terrorized, and we'll come north hoping we can get something better. Although some people have been pretty disappointed about that too. But it made a difference nevertheless. My mother was one of those persons who went from the South, came to the North. And I got an education in a very racist community, but I did get an education that I would not have gotten where she was. And it has served me nevertheless. So I think the ecumenical movement, when people got together across those lines and really tried to embody the visible unity, I think that has made a difference. And I think we need to keep doing that. When we were meeting, as you know, as leaders in the other room, I was saying, I think we have to be very intentional in being uncomfortable in the uncomfortable spaces together and be comfortable with that. So I think it has had an impact. And I think at the 75th, when we looked back and did our reports, I think we could see, I mean, you could see, for example, if you want to look at it at an ecclesial level, we saw the unity movement of churches that came together in the 50s. You got the United Church of Christ, you know, the United Methodist Church, you got Koku, you got, you know, all of that happened in part. And now we have full communion with some churches that were not in communion at all. We have Vatican II. I think it made a huge difference. I don't know that I would be in the company of my Catholic brothers and sisters the way that I am now. I mean, I have actually sojourned in my lifetime with the Graymoor Institute, and I need to say her name again, Sister Paul Teresa Hennessy, who would show up with me at historic Black church meetings, just she and I, the only women in the room, but she was welcomed. Those pastors welcomed her because she had this gift of being hospitable, representing the Graymoor Institute. So I'm just saying, I think we have seen some clear indicators in the real sense of time, but I would like to see much more. And I think we can. And you know what? I think a lot of our children don't make the kind of demarcations we make. I mean, they pull out a phone, they talk to everybody. Now, they may not keep company with them like we do, like, you know, but they're talking to each other. And maybe don't make some of the distinctions that some of us older ones do. But I still pray for them too. I think they can do some things better also.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walker Smith.
Thank you.
Johnny, please. And thank you also to the Friars of Atonement for sponsoring this program. We're happy to have Terry and Brian and Jean join us. And also thank you to the president and deans of ACTS for staying on there for this event. And I want to remind those of us in person, as we walk out of the door, there is a gift bag for each one of us from the Friars of Atonement. Please grab one. And for those who have joined us on Zoom, we are happy that you did join us. I know we can't take all the questions, but this conversation is ongoing, and we continue to have it in the classroom, in our churches, and in all the places we gather for a community dialogue and spirit. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.
I hold one question. What are we gonna do about this place for the 473 tribes? This place, I'm around here. As a good place, all the way to the middle.
I think we're gonna just.
Yeah, I enjoyed some dinner. It was great.